You're live, Commissioner.
Good morning. I'm Commissioner Gary Edwards, and I will be presiding over today's appeal. Commissioner Mejia is seated to my right. Commissioner Menser is on excused absence. Today's date is December 15th, 2021, about 9:05 a.m. in the morning. The Thurston County Board of Commissioners is now on the record in an appeal filed by Mr. Hartley of the hearings examiner's decision dated November 1st, 2021. This decision approved Mr. Mason's request for a reasonable use exception to construct a 1,340 square foot single family residence, a detached 720 square foot garage, and a sewage disposal system partially within a landslide hazard area buffer. The property is located at 7005 Boston Harbor Extension Road Northeast, Olympia, Washington, 98506. Before a reasonable use exemption can be approved for construction of a single-family residence partially within a landslide hazard area buffer, Mr. Manson must demonstrate that without these improvements, no other reasonable use of the property as a whole is permitted by the Critical Areas Ordinance. The hearing examiner determined that construction of the proposed single-family residence is limited to the minimum necessary to prevent denial of all reasonable use of the property. Based on the modest size of the residence and the need to ensure minimum sanitary setbacks, it does not appear that the size of the residence could be reasonably reduced. The issues before the Board of County Commissioners today are whether, one, the hearings examiner conclusion that without the proposed single-family residence garage and sewage system, no other reasonable use of the property is permitted by the Critical Areas Ordinance, is consistent with Thurston County Code 24.45.030, and two, whether the hearing examiner's findings that the encroachment into the landslide hazardous area, buffer area, will not adversely affect the bluff or critical areas, is supported by evidence in the record. This is an appearance of fairness declaration that myself and Commissioner Menser will be doing. In a quasi-judicial appeals, the board is subject to the appearance of fairness doctrine, codified in RCW 42.36. Under this doctrine, the board members are not authorized to have ex parte communications with the parties after an appeal has been filed with the board. However, if there have been ex parte communication since the appeal was filed, or communication or relationships with any of the parties that may appear to impact their impartiality, then the substance of that communication or relationship needs to be disclosed. In addition, each board member must be able to impartially judge this case on the facts contained in the record and the applicable law. At this time, I will ask each commissioner present to make a declaration for the record. Since this appeal was filed on November 1st, 2021, and could you follow through with that, Commissioner Mejia?
Yes. Since the appeal was filed on November 1st, 2021, I have not had any ex parte communications with any of the parties to this appeal, and I affirm that I can fairly and impartially judge this case on the facts in this record and applicable law.
And I also will make that, attest to that same thing. Since the appeal was filed on November 1st, 2021, I have not had any ex parte communications with any of the parties to this appeal, and I affirm that I can fairly and impartially judge this case on the facts in the record and applicable law. Do any of the parties here have any questions or challenges for any board member to decide this case? Hearing none, I guess we'll move ahead. This is the direction that we need you to follow. The appellant and the applicant each have an opportunity to present 15 minutes of oral argument. Oral argument may not present new information or evidence, but must be limited to the evidence in the record. And the specific issues raised in the appellant's appeal. After an initial 15 minutes of oral arguments, each party will have an additional 5 minutes to respond. I understand that the department will not be presenting oral arguments, but is available to answer questions from the Board of Commissioners. The board, if it has any questions, will ask them of the parties during or after argument. Do any of the parties have any questions before we begin oral arguments?
Yes. Please come to the podium, please.
Please come up to the microphone, sir.
Introduce yourself.
Please, yeah, there you go.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is David Hartley. I am the appellant. And I guess 15 minutes is a lot of time, plus 5 minutes rebuttal, which is very generous. But in an effort not to waste the commissioner's time, I'd like to know what information have the commissioners had a chance to read the appeal document, or do I need to present basically what I have stated in the appeal document as part of my oral argument?
Sir, that's going to be up to you. When we talk about what in-depth we did, I think we reviewed this document is the best that I can put it at this point in time.
The document presented to the Board of County Commissioners is the document on record presented before the hearing examiners.
Yes.
So, and no new evidence, no new materials be presented today. If there's any new materials or new evidence presented today, the hearing might be stopped because those will not be introduced, and the Board of County Commissioners may not take that into account as they go through this hearing.
I understand. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. If we, as it was said, that it sounds like 15 minutes could be a long time, but we want to make sure that people have adequate time to present their case as they see fit. And any questions that myself or Commissioner Mejia might ask will not detract from your time. So I just want to make that clear. Okay, this hearing, I'll make it all official here. This hearing is now open. So, who's going first, Council?
The appellant.
Appellant goes first. Okay. Mr. Hartley.
Sir, I will be tracking the time here, and I will give you cues as to when the time may be coming up. Okay?
That's fair. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more fully, if I may. I am David Hartley. I am a resident of Boston Harbor, and I am a year-round, near daily user of Burfoot Park. I am also a professional water resources engineer with over 30 years' experience in watershed hydrology, soil erosion, water quality, and hydroecology. I hold bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in civil engineering. I am an elected member of the Boston Harbor Utility Advisory Committee and a board-appointed member to Thurston County's Stormwater and Surface Water Advisory Board for District 1. The basis of my appeal is that the hearing examiner's decision is a result of some false and misleading information provided to the examiner related to the administratively granted critical areas review permit that is inconsistent with Thurston County Code 24.25.025. And secondly, that the examiner erred in concluding that no reasonable use with less impact on the critical area or buffer is possible as required under the code 24.45.030. The hearing examiner's decision document dated November 1st, 2021 references the previous critical area review permit allowing a 50% reduction in stream buffer and asserting that no reasonable use exemption is therefore required to reduce the stream buffer, the riparian buffer. This is stated in examiner's finding number 7. Submission of the CARP, Critical Areas Review Permit, to the hearing examiner record without any statement of concern about its appropriateness conveyed to the examiner that Mr. McCormick's decision, the planner's decision to grant the buffer reduction reflected his due diligence in reviewing the applicant's materials and the corresponding code. There was no such due diligence. The granting of the CARP with buffer reduction and its submission to the hearing examiner record abetted a false impression that the buffer reduction was in accord with 24.25.025 and lent support to the credibility of the applicant and the applicant's consultants when it was clear this credibility is not deserved. The applicant's critical areas consultant misstated the code 24.25.025, egregiously omitting relevant language in the code. This is in Exhibit 1H of the applicant's critical areas report by Lewitt Consulting on page 11. The applicant's critical areas consultant provided an estimate of 0.2, this is in the record, the hearing examiner's record, provided an estimate of 0.26 miles as the downstream distance from the project's abutting stream reach to Puget Sound, but provided no basis for that estimate except a map figure with insufficient resolution to make that estimate.
Mr. Hartley, I have a question.
Yes.
The question, sir.
Where is that information in the hearings examiner?
It is in Exhibit 1H, Critical Areas Report, Lewitt Consulting Group. It's page 10 Figure 6. The applicant's critical areas consultant omitted mention of the significant downstream open water estuarine wetland that was described in Mr. Carmen's statement to the hearing examiner, Exhibit 4B of the examiner's record. This wetland is well within the quarter mile of the Mason project stream reach, as is easily seen on Google Earth. I don't want to dwell too much on this except to say that critical information was omitted by the applicant and by the applicant's consultant, and it's difficult to impeach evidence when you're not able to bring in the contrary evidence. But it's actually inconsistent in and of itself. 0.26 miles is 1/100th of a mile over a regulatory threshold of a quarter mile, 0.25, and therefore the wetland is within a quarter mile of the applicant's project, and an administrative reduction of the stream buffer is not allowed under the code. The code is violated, and that was hidden from the hearing examiner. The second basis of the appeal has to do with the geologic hazard and the placement of a septic system extremely close to the top of a steep geohazard slope. In my statement of appeal, I cite the provisions of the code, 24.45.030, that require satisfaction for a reasonable use exemption to be granted. No reasonable use with less impact on the critical area or buffer can be possible. At a minimum, the alternatives reviewed shall include a change in use, reduction in size, a change in the timing of the activity, a revision in the project design. This may include variance for yard setbacks, etc. In response to that requirement of the code, the examiner stated in conclusion 2 that this paragraph's requirements had been met, but this is not the case. The examiner failed to require an alternative site design that places the septic pod further away from or totally out of the landslide hazard area buffer. Noted on the applicant's site plan, no such alternative was presented or discussed by the applicant. The topographic lines on the applicant's site plan, attachment F in the staff report to the hearing examiner, clearly show that the location of Glendon Pod B is hazardous from a hydrologic, geotechnical, and water quality point of view. In finding 10, the examiner states, having considered the public comment expressing concerns that the placement of the septic treatment pod closest to the top of the slope would potentially impact slope stability, the applicant's consultant reiterated his professional opinion that placement of pod B within the retained top of slope buffer would not contribute significant hydrology to the slope and thus would not negatively impact slope stability. That's Exhibit 6. In fact, the applicant's geotechnical consultant failed to address risks posed by the placement of Pod B, which is shown on the applicant's site plan, and actually warned against conditions that Pod B's location was surely going to create. For example, the applicant's geotechnical consultant concluded in the steep slope evaluation report dated June 29, 2021, Exhibit 1G, with the following admonition. All stormwater drainage, foundation drainage, and road runoff should be routed through tight lines to the base of the slope or discharge to an engineered stormwater system if available. Collected drainage and runoff should not be allowed to discharge on the face of the slope. The applicant's own geology consultant is warning against allowing any project drainage, which should include wastewater from the septic pod.
4 minutes, sir.
How many?
4 minutes.
Thank you. To discharge onto the face of the slope. I'm not going to continue to go on detail by detail because what these points are really, they're written in my appeal document. And so they are available to the commissioners to look at their leisure if they haven't done so already. I will conclude by saying that the hearing examiner was confronted with a mass of information to evaluate in making a decision on the Mason reasonable use exemption. Much of that information was indeed objective, but critical pieces were incorrect and highly biased. Factors affecting the examiner's decision, including the ability to properly judge the credibility of assurances by the applicant and the applicant's consultants that no harm would result from this project, were undermined by a lack of due diligence on the part of county staff in reviewing the applicant's materials. The approval of Mr. Mason's reasonable use exemption is based on a fiction that has been promoted by the applicant and unfortunately accepted by the hearing examiner, that keeping a septic system well away from an extremely steep slope above a stream reach that is within 1/4 mile of a high-value wetland and Puget Sound is the lowest priority in the layout of the project when it should be the highest. Allowing this project to go forward by sustaining the hearing examiner's decision is environmentally and procedurally unsound. Residents of Thurston County expect and deserve to have a modicum of protection for environmental resources afforded by applicable county codes. They're not getting it so far. Instead of enforcement of environmental codes that protect cherished public resources such as the Burkett Park stream, wetland, beach, and Puget Sound shore, we have witnessed disinterest, negligence, and rule bending. I submit that this project should not be allowed to go forward as is, and hope that alternatives can be found. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Mr. Mason, do you like to present your arguments?
And good morning, Commissioners. Todd Mason, and applicant for this project, obviously. First off, I'd like to acknowledge, as I did in the public hearing, that there's been public concern in the area, and I appreciate that because I think what they're seeing of the property is exactly what I have seen. It's a remarkable piece of property. Native trees, vegetation, it blends in with Burfoot Park, which is adjacent on 2 sides. I also, in the public hearing for the reasonable use, gave testimony of kind of my personal life on it, and I really do believe it's relevant. For over 30 years, I've been an avid open water swimmer, and that's year-round. And well before I even purchased this property or even thought about purchasing the property, I parked right in front of it to walk down and swim Puget Sound yearly. I mean, at least probably twice a week. And I'd drive 45 miles there, park in front, go swim Puget Sound, come back, freezing cold, no wetsuit, get in my car, shiver, shiver, shiver in front of this lot. And I thought, a couple of years ago, like, why don't I buy this lot? It was for sale, and build a little house there. So I offer this testimony because when we're talking about the environment, stream, everything else, I'm literally in it on a weekly basis. So if anyone's concerned about water quality of the stream of Puget Sound, I'm all in. Also relevant on this is my full intent is to make a very low impact house, the construction, and really let it be a model. The piece of property, as you guys are aware, I've gone through through vacation for a 30-foot strip between my property and Burfoot Park that has been unopened since it was established in 1907. My reason for that, and it shows in an aerial of my response to the hearings examiner comments, is there's a clearing, and it allows me to place my house in my garage in that clearing and gives me more a 30-foot buffer of all the existing trees and natural vegetation, including additional trees and natural vegetation I'll be planting to buffer me from the immediate neighbor, Mrs. Belmonte, or Miss Belmonte. So when I looked at the property, I had to go through due diligence. Mr. Hartley is concerned that maybe alternate designs were not taken into account. So of course, on this piece of property, Boston Harbor utility sewer line runs right across the front, but way back when they created the LID, the property owner did not elect to participate. And so right now, I kept pursuing, can I just hook up to the sewer line? That's not allowed. That's why I had to go with septic. My septic design included digging 6 holes throughout the site to find suitable soils. My preference, absolutely, and from the first proposal forward, was to put both septic pods near the road. Mainly, I'll admit, it'd be a lot cheaper than going clear to the back. And also, if I could locate it, it'd be less disturbance. What we found, though, is the 2 suitable areas are exactly where Pod A and Pod B are located. And Pod B is actually probably the best soils. And Mr. Hartley mentions about topographic lines, but if you were to go out and look at the site, it's flat in that area. And then, yes, the slope to the ravine is north of there. Now, for this, septic designs are governed by Department of Health, Washington State Department of Health, for the guidelines for septic design. And so the septic designer had to go through and do the design based on that, meets all setbacks, no waivers, nothing was requested. The design completely meets Washington State Department of Health. Thurston County Planning has a provision of not placing septic drain fields within critical area buffers. And so that's why had to come for reasonable use. Let's see. And I might mention the septic system that's proposed. It's a proprietary, Glendon system is the proprietary name. And it meets higher level.
Excuse me, what was that name again, please?
Glendon.
Glendon?
Yes, Glendon. 2 guys that came up with it years ago. One was named Glenn, the other Don, I guess. Anyway, they put it together. Anyway, it's considered the highest level of treatment for an effluent system, short of adding chemicals in as you would do for a larger, community system. They built it originally as, hey, you could put the septic system on a sidewalk and it would still function. Brief explanation is the water goes into a big concrete vault and it percolates up through multiple media layers, comes out the top through a sand mound system, as you probably have seen. So it goes out through that and then back down and then into the ground. Now, an important part on this is Mr. Hartley has raised concerns, and rightfully so. We want to make sure we protect the bank. But he's talking about this overland flow and the geotech report saying, stormwater should be collected and routed to the bottom. Drain fields do not create above ground flow. Drain field areas, as you guys are probably aware, they have to look at what's the size of area for the absorption rate, and then the water goes into the ground. And so that's why I had to do all these holes throughout the site to find 2 areas. If it didn't matter and water could just sheet flow, it wouldn't matter what the soils are. The soils have to be able to accept that water. And so I hired the geotechnical expert to evaluate that too. Steep slopes. So the steep slopes is the subject matter of the reasonable use exception. And when applicants go on Geodata website for Thurston County, there's mapped areas of steep slopes, and on-site reconnaissance requires something to be considered a steep slope if it's over a 40% grade. Now, mind you, that 40% grade is less than like your stairs that you just walked up this morning. But of course, we're not going to have people, or the county's not going to have people go out and evaluate flat land. So you have to distinguish what's an area that has maybe a possibility of landslide. And then the ordinance addresses that without the applicants needing to get any kind of professionals to go out and look at the soils. It could be absolute hard bedrock, but the requirements are either stay 50 feet back from that top of slope, or from the bottom of the slope, and there's some different diagrams that I did in the response, you project the line up at a 2-to-1 slope and put your structure behind there. So those 2 are allowed without any kind of geological study, any professional reports. So in my case, with the natural slope of the land there in the soils, the 50 feet back, because my slope isn't vertical, or even close to vertical for that ravine, is the 50 foot in the depth of my lot really encumbered my ability to put a small, modest house. So I hired the geotech. And he went out there and his staff went out there and they did the report. And, his comment to me when he called, it's like, boy, my staff and I, we don't even know why we're out here. But it does, because the soils are very, very stable. And that's what I pointed out too in my response and in the public hearing, is the soils in that area. You take just to the north of my site, Bayview Drive. There's houses along there that every one of those houses on Bayview Drive sits within that 2-to-1 slope setback. So if there were going to be that sloughing, we would have seen failures out there well before now. I also pointed out at Burfoot Park, and Mr. Hartley in his appeal, he shows a picture of the bank. And it's a vertical bank of Burfoot Park on Puget Sound. And, I was out there swimming Saturday morning, and yes, it was stormy as stormy can be, and the waves were huge, and they come up and they hit the bottom of that slope, and they keep undermining it. And so, yes, there's sloughing, but it's vertical. People go along the top. They put their tents up there, everything else. There's no failures. That's how stable the slope or the slopes are in that area. So, I thought I heard interruption. So when it comes to the slope stability, again, my plan is my permanent residence. I have no interest in sliding down or creating any kind of erosion concerns for that, for the stream. Originally, when I applied, this is my first time through personally going through reasonable use exception. And I thought that the critical areas would also be a subject of the reasonable use exception, and in addition to the slope. And then it was explained to me that no, because the code allows that 50% reduction with my report. And I said, well, you know, it didn't make sense. And so it was a 75-foot buffer. It was explained to me, if I requested a 70-foot buffer, then it could go to the hearings examiner. That's like, but I don't want 70 feet.
4 minutes, sir.
Okay. So the whole point here is it's a 2-bedroom, single-family house, detached 2-car garage. I'm putting it in, placing the house with minimal disturbance, and my mitigation plan is to enhance it all. I don't have an on-grade patio for me or any guest to walk out into this area. Effectively, I'm making the entire site critical areas with planting of native trees and plants. The detached garage with the house, it's separated by, I think it's like 10 feet. And you'll see the hatching on the site plan between the garage and the house. There's hatching marks there. That's to build an elevated bridge to match the bridges in Burfoot Park. I really have this vision of this small, low-impact house that complements Burfoot Park, and it's, you know, becomes a, where's Burfoot start and where's my property? I love that natural environment. I want to retain it. If this is all about the environment, boy, I'd love it if the residents came and talked to me, because I think if I could show them exactly what I'm going to do in my vision, it would relieve a lot of concern. Yeah, I appreciate the process, and I understand the public's concern, because it's an absolutely gorgeous area, Burfoot Park and Boston Harbor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hartley, would you like to use your 5 minutes to respond to anything?
This is my one opportunity to use that 5 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll take it. Thank you. Mr. Mason referred to the buffer reduction, 50% buffer reduction. The fact is that did not require a reasonable use exemption and before the hearing examiner. Yes, it did require that, because the code specifically says that the conditions of his site, its proximity to Puget Sound and the estuarine wetland do not allow a 50% reduction in buffer. It was given to him incorrectly through no review process of his consultant's report. Mr. Mason talked about surface runoff from a Glendon pod. It's not just about surface runoff. It's about saturation of the soils on top of that slope, which can lead to slope failure. Subsurface flow.
Please address the board, sir.
I'm talking through a microphone. I'm addressing them.
Thank you.
I will reiterate that the consultant, geotechnical consultant, said do not add moisture to the top of the slope. And the Glendon pod's going to do that. It's not going to spread out over his entire lot. It should not be placed there. "30 years ago, property owners in Boston Harbor paid dearly to stop septic pollution of the Sound by building a wastewater collection system. This septic pod at the edge of the ravine reverses that progress made by the residents of Boston Harbor. If there was ever a project that merited due diligence, during critical area review instead of a knee-jerk rubber stamp on the applicant's consultant report. This is that project. If there was ever an applicant for whom granting a pass would be a bad idea, this is that applicant, a senior Thurston County staffer. This project is an environmental disaster, and the permitting process has been a travesty. I do not know the mechanisms by which alternatives to the current project might occur. However, I would like to suggest some of those alternatives. The applicant could develop an alternative site plan that sets both septic pods A and B away from the ravine slope. Or the applicant revises the project to be a single-bedroom home that requires the construction of a single septic pod, such as septic pod A, which is away from the slope. 3, the applicant buys a Boston Harbor utility sewer connection from another owner. Several connections associated with unimproved lots are currently unused.
1 minute, sir.
Pardon?
1 minute.
Thank you. Barring 1 through 3, Thurston County buys the applicant's property, thereby adding to Burfoot Park and securing both landslide hazard and riparian buffers specified in the county's critical areas code, and protecting a cherished resource. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mason, do you wish to close out your 5 minutes?
Yes, thank you for that. With the stream, I hired a consultant. He did the measurement from where he determined the measurement would be Puget Sound or any associated wetland up to the site. For the stream buffer, if it was a third of the mile, or I mean, let's say it was 500 feet from us, then yes, it could go through reasonable use, and the result would be the same. Reasonable use of this piece of property is a single-family house. So if the buffer is 75 feet or 300 feet, whatever it is, reasonable use allows me reasonable use of this property to have a single-family house. I hired a geotech. He evaluated the septic system after the design with the specific placement. It did not find any concerns with it. Mr. Hartley brought up a couple things of looking at alternatives. And as I gave in my original testimony, we dug throughout that site looking for other areas that the septic pods could be placed. Where A and B are placed is where they need to be. I would be interested in talking with Mr. Hartley after the hearing. He brings up that there's other connections that possibly might be available. I thought I pursued all avenues on that. I'd love to hook up to Boston Harbor Sewer if that's a possibility. It's going to cost about the same. As far as a single bedroom, single pod, health code requires a 2-bedroom septic. I can't have just a 1-bedroom house with 1 pod. Trust me, I would love to. I mean, that'd have half the cost of my septic system, and I wouldn't have any guests overstaying their welcome. But anyway, it has to be 2 pods. It has to be A and B. And as far as the county or anyone else purchasing the property, if anyone's interested in purchasing the property, talk to me. Everything's always for sale. And I really believe in my heart of hearts that the proposal I'm doing is going to be the best use, and the community is going to like it when it is done. In regards to being a senior manager here at Thurston County, we've been extremely careful to make sure there isn't any review by my department or on my behalf. when there's statements of rubber stamping, I'd just like to, acknowledge that it's been 1 year and 7 months that I've been going through this process. If there's any rubber stamping going on, it hasn't been happening very good. I've gone through the processes, each step of the way, the processes of Thurston County, and it's all above board. It's all can be public record. And so I guess I take a little bit of personal offense to those attacks, but I also recognize that appearance, and I can appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Okay. I'll ask council before I conclude, or did we miss anything?
Is there any questions that you may have?
I do not personally have any questions.
I don't have any
Commissioner Mejia?
follow-up questions.
And council, we've covered all of our legal requirements here. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here and presenting your case, and those that might be observing. The board will issue a written decision on or before January 15th, 2022. So this hearing is now concluded, and thank you very much.